Hi, I'm Ruth from the Society of Australian Genealogists, and my talk is There's No Place Like a Convict Hulk. I'd like to acknowledge that I am recording this talk on Gadigal land. The First Nations Gadigal people are the traditional custodians of country. I'm going to talk about the convict hulk in context, the convict hulk as a sense of place, the convict hulk as somebody's home. It's not a new phenomenon though. This is a fairly recent picture of a prison ship off the Dorset coast in England, but I want to take us back to the 19th century and think about the hulk as a residence. Your ancestor may have been incarcerated here, but they may have also been returned to their loved one, or they died on the ship, and there were those that were transported to the colonies. In 1842, the year that our case study was transported to Australia, there were 4,280 inmates in prison hulks in England. And of these, 3,615 were transported to Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania in Australia. So this is really to let you know about the incarceration system in general, but I also want to talk about the ship Euralis, which was the boys' ship. So they had a particular ship that was designated for children to keep them separated from the male prisoners. It's also worth noting for those with French heritage that hulks were also a location for French prisoners of war in the Napoleonic Wars period. Here's a record of our case study, Charles Davis. So he was a child criminal. When he was a teen, he got caught several times before the courts. This is an image of his last offence, which was stealing a handkerchief in London in 1841. He was then put on prison hulks, and I'm fairly sure he had been in prison hulks before. How do I know? There are prison hulk registers. One of the easiest ways to have a look at them is to go to the Find My Past website, and they will let you know sort of dates and names and times and where convicted. The Charles Davis I've got here isn't my guy. I actually found him on another record, but these Charles Davis were all put on the Euralis, the boys' ship, as I think mine was also with previous convictions. The website Prison History, which is from a research centre at the Open University, has a really great way of looking into the detail of the hulks and other prisons. And it gives us the location of the Euralis, which is just off Chatham Dockyard. This is my guy. This tells me about Charles's prison record on the Leviathan hulk, and gives me a bit of an insight into the time he was there and you know, what happened to him. So this is also from Find My Past. Back to the Euralis though, the boys' prison ship. This is a really lovely painting or representation of a painting that Jeff Hunt did about the Euralis in its prime when it was fighting battles alongside Nelson. It then got decommissioned and became the boys' home, the Euralis Convict Prison Hulk. It was more just off the Chatham Dockyards, and the boys then would have probably had a view very similar to this. I took this a few months ago. If you take out a few buildings, the view is pretty much the same. The wonderful people of the Rochester Guildhall Museum have recreated what a convict hulk looked like inside their building. And here are some scenes of that display. You know, the hammocks are rather chilling, I think, on how people lived. But that's what I'm trying to tell you, to think about the hulk as a residence. It was just horrendous. You can think that the boys had the worst time of all of the convicts because unlike the adult men, they weren't allowed to get off the ship. There was poor sanitation. There was not a lot of access to fresh air and sunshine because a lot of the time they were kept below decks. There weren't proper sewage systems, and so disease was rife. There wasn't a lot of good hygiene practice. And so you had dysentery, scurvy, and typhus, just to name a few diseases. There was a high mortality rate. Food wasn't great. You could imagine hard bread, salt beef, and maybe a bit of porridge if they were lucky. And disciplines were harsh. So all in all, it was pretty awful. There were quality controls and there was an inquiry. But the issue with the hulks is that they were privately franchised out. So those responsible were really thinking about profit rather than comfort and rehabilitation. An 1835 inquiry had a witness declaring that they would rather see a child of theirs dead than go on the Urals and spend time there as a prisoner. So where can you get records? I told you about Find My Past. There's some great things. There's a lot of things, obviously, that stem from the National Archives and the UK Parliamentary Archives. If you can go in person, I'd highly recommend going to either or both Chatham and Portsmouth Historic Dockyards. They're brilliant. Not to forget that prison history website, but also the Rochester Guildhall Museum. Some of the records are important because they were how those that ran the hulks made their money. The registers were kept well so they could get money per person that they were keeping alive, maybe barely. And this was home to these boys and these men for months, if not years. There's some great books around. And I'd really like to thank Mick Davis for recently writing The English Convict Hulks. And I love this quote: "The majority of convicts were working class people sentenced by middle class judges with a mutual distrust and contempt. The lower orders were trying to make ends meet and the ruling class defending their property against what they saw was a tide of undeserving wretches." Some of them were criminals, but it's a really great way of putting all of this into context at the time. What happened to the prison hulk? It got scrapped, of course, really not long after Charles and others like him were transported. What happened to Charles, though? So he is the second great-grandfather of one of my first cousins once removed. Charles went on from strength to strength once he got to Australia. Although he went from teen thief to hulks resident, after he got his freedom, he became a husband and father and set up a really prosperous business in Hobart and became a community leader there. The irony of ironies was Charles was once kept at Her Majesty's pleasure, as in Queen Victoria, and his grandson, Noel Davis, became in 1953 one of Tasmania's representatives at Queen Elizabeth II's coronation. It's interesting how fortune favours people across time and place. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope you'll have a sense of the hulker's place. And for thousands of people, it was home. But more than that, it was part of a system, and a system of incarceration and control that for hundreds of years really meant that across the globe we had slavery, indentured servant programs, denials of First Nations people, their human rights. And when your gender mattered or lack of property mattered as to whether you could vote or not, and if your socioeconomic status was maintained through receiving poverty wages, sometimes you had to turn to crime. So I hope you have a greater understanding of the sense of place that was a convict hulk and the sense of the case study in that system. These are my contact details and those of the Society of Australian Genealogists. I hope you're able to be with us online or in person one day.